Hello, everyone. Welcome to Next Big Future. I'm Brian Wang. Today I'm going to talk about SpaceX, which people tend to focus on the immediate launches that SpaceX is doing, or on the farther future where SpaceX will colonize the moon or Mars. I'm going to talk about more the middle time frame, where I think within 5 years, SpaceX will make huge progress in dominating communication and even air cargo. Let me describe how that will happen in a relatively short time, and also be a major driver in the valuation of SpaceX and Starlink. So SpaceX already has successes, as most people know. Let me just review that quickly. SpaceX is about 90% of the commercial launch market, so not counting military launches for China or for Russia. So the commercial launch, so what's actually competitive in the launch market. And they have 90% of the launch market. By weight, by payload, might even be higher, by 95%. So they have done 151 launches. And they started basically from 2012 with virtually nothing. And then even 113 landings, and 90 have been reflown. And no one else has been, after Rocket Labs has done any recovery of any of the launch boosters. But virtually no one else has done that. So SpaceX launched Domination. You can see this chart, how in 2012 they have almost nothing, and the big players are Russia and Ariane Europe. And then the green shows that where they just shoot up, gain the lead in 2016, and then, about triple whatever anyone else is doing by 2021, last year. And now this year, they're going to double their launches up to 60 launches versus everyone else. And now with Russia was already out of commercial launch virtually because of the price competition, where SpaceX was about half or less of the cost of their launches by weight. But now with the Ukraine war, all the Russian launches are off. OneWeb, which went bankrupt and got reemerged with mostly UK funding. They were going to have launches by the Soyuz too, but now they've gone to SpaceX for the launches because of that war. Also, in this chart of other launch vehicles in commercial launch, the Electron, Vega, the Kaizu, and the PSLV are all tiny rockets launching about 1 ton. The PSLV launches about 3.8 tons versus 22 tons for the Falcon 9. The Ariane 5 is also a similar class, but about 4 times more expensive. So this is the nature of SpaceX's domination from launch. But launch is actually a tiny part of the overall space business. The overall space business is over $300 billion. Launch is only about $10 billion of that or less. And the bulk of the money is in the satellite services, the communications, the TV services via satellites. And satellites is where Starlink is, because SpaceX launches its own and builds its own Starlink satellites. The roadmap for this is that beside the current version of satellites they have, their version 1.5 satellites now, they're going to create a second generation of satellites. And SpaceX will relaunch entirely new fleets of satellites every 5 years, because they are launched to a low Earth orbit between 300 and 600 miles up. A little bit of atmosphere still up there, very tiny amount, but enough to put some drag on the satellites, so that every 5 years they'll use up their fuel and they'll then drop down and burn up in the atmosphere, and they have to replace all of them. But because SpaceX has so much launch capability, they will be able to replace all those satellites every 5 years. And Generation 2 satellites, which they've already filed with the FCC, will be 5 times bigger and have 5 times the bandwidth of these satellites. So SpaceX can go from now 2,100 of these of the low Earth orbit satellites, going up to by 4,000 by the end of the year, almost completing their first shell on low Earth orbit satellites, and add another 8,000 after that, which could take a year or two, depending upon if they get the Starship going. And then they'll launch 30,000 of the bigger satellites. That will mean that they can have, with 5 times more capacity on each of the Generation 2 satellites, they will be able to service perhaps maybe 200 million people, certainly 180 million people based on the bandwidth calculation, how much they will use for each one versus about 10 to 20 million for the current shell of the smaller satellite, the 12,000, the smaller satellite. So that will mean they'll have 100 times the revenue, and they'll do this by 2026, when they will be launching many of these satellites with the fully reusable Super Starship, which hopefully should go to orbit in May or June for the first time. There have been delays because of regulatory approvals, et cetera, like that. So Starlink will probably IPO. So SpaceX will spin out the communications portion of that. And SpaceX is already worth 130 billion now, up from 46 billion. So about triple from the early part of last year. And then with the IPO, they'll again go up in value. So Starlink revenue, they've had 250,000 users so far up into March. They started adding about 50,000 per month in the first 2 months of 2022. So they'll probably end 2022 with about 1 million people, going from $30 million per year in annualized revenue now, going up to over $1 billion. So that'll be significant relative to their launch revenue. They also get $880 million from the FCC for providing communications, internet communications to rural areas that are not well served. And their target speed for 2022 is 300 megabits per second with 20 milliseconds of latency. Latency being that how long till you get the first bit of data from a connection, which is better than most ground-based fiber communications, that level of latency. And any long distance communication, because of lasers light going faster in a vacuum versus going through a fiber, by physics, SpaceX will have the lowest latency over any distance, communication distance over 2,000, 3,000 miles. So that'll be important for certain services like financial trading, certain other businesses. So then there'll be premium, people paying for the premium service of SpaceX communications for the fact that they have superior latency and communication speed. So like I said, they have a plan for 30,000 bigger satellites, serving 150, 200 million Generation 2 users. And that'll be a lot of revenue and a lot of profits by 2026. And then a Generation 3 will follow, I'm expecting, with 120,000 satellites. And then they'll be serving 3 billion, basically half the planet. They can serve half the planet or even the whole planet, depending on the communication speed. And then they'll get into trillions of revenue. Starlink satellites, when they get them down below this $250,000, they will be cheaper than cell phone towers. The reason being, cell phone towers, even though their cell phone towers cost $150,000 each, there's about $50,000 per year of rent, because the phone companies and cell phone companies don't own the land in general, where these 5 million cell towers are around the world. They rent that from someone, and then they charge for that rent. So if you have 5 years of rent, 250K plus 150K for the cell tower, that's 400K. So get below that, and your satellite, because you're paying no rent up in space, is cheaper. It's a relaunch every 5 years, but the economics of satellites can actually be superior to cell phone towers and ground-based systems. So the bandwidth can be superior, the constantly refreshing technology. So it will just end up working out better, so that you can have complete communication dominance with a better product, faster communication, faster latency. So that will be how SpaceX will end up dominating global communications with successive generations of these satellites with high-speed communication and low latency. The other major market, which SpaceX will start dominating, is with air cargo transport. People think about SpaceX's demonstrations where they talk about point-to-point travel, moving passengers. The intermediate stage, from transporting a few dozen astronauts per year to millions of people in between, is moving air cargo. And here's where the economics and the speed will be vastly better for SpaceX rockets. You get them fully reusable, and then they will travel at 25,000 miles per hour, basically 30 times faster, or 30 times faster than a regular plane, right? 25,000 miles per hour, 600 miles per hour, or even 500 miles per hour, and 30 times lower cost. A big 787 or Airbus 340, whatever like that, cost $250 to $450 million each. 30 times higher cost for the plane versus the Starship, just the top portion of the Starship super heavy system. That's top portion, the Starship portion, will be able to fly 8,000, 10,000 miles in one go, which is more than the long haul rocket planes, and in one piece, no separating pieces, just one piece up and then down and land. And the cost of that in the metal and the cost of rocket engines. I'll discuss the cost of rocket engines, but basically the ability to get the cost down below $10 million a piece, and then the operating costs and maintenance costs can be roughly equivalent for the plane and for the rocket. So then you're just left with lower cost and higher speed. SpaceX will be doing this with a catch and reuse system, where they're building the Mechazilla to catch that top portion of the system. For air cargo, they only do this because they don't only need the booster to go to space, to orbit. If you don't go orbit, you just need the top stage. So they catch and relaunch the rockets right away. They catch it, refuel it, so then you have to use some slow crawler and move it for a day or a week or whatever. So they'll be building massive facilities all over the world. They're really building a second Starbase, one in Texas, one in Florida, and they're converting oil rigs for launching and landing. So, and the Raptor engines we're talking about, they have a new factory that can make 1,000 per year, which is enough for 100 Starships, 9 engines each, 900. And then you also have 5 boosters with about 200 engines. So in the first year, you use 200 of the engines. But then the boosters can support 20 Starships, because I can relaunch the boosters every hour. They fly up only to 50 miles, 20 miles, something like that, detach, and then fly back to the launch pad. So then fly back in a few minutes, and then refuel, ready to go again in an hour. So if you're launching one Starship every day, you could have to go to orbit, go around a few times and come back down. You get far more use of each booster versus the Starships if you go into orbit. If you go in point to point on Earth, you don't even need the boosters at all, just more and more Starships. So building more and more engines means, a little less than 1/10, sorry, a little more than 1/10 would be how many you need for each Starship. With 100% reusability, cost could get down to $5 million for 220 tons to orbit, about $30 per kilogram, massive cost efficiency. Raptor engine, we're making a generation 2 of it. It's twice as powerful as the first one. Target cost $1,000 per ton of force. It's about $200,000 per engine. Now they're currently more to $2 million. So it's bringing down the cost by 5 to 10 times. And that will let them mass produce the Starships and get to this air cargo, services air cargo scenario with many, many Starships. There's also some ride sharing and stuff to go to orbit, but for on the ground, it's just you rolling in and out with your cargo containers. So they will take over air cargo. The global air cargo industry is about $140 billion, which is larger than the $10 billion rocket market, launch market to orbit. Again, 30 times faster, 4 times more payload. All rig launch. This is a graphic showing the rendering of a all rig launch system. And they'll have many launch sites and factories all over the world. The military has already funded a demonstration of this 1-hour cargo delivery system. The Space Force and the Air Force have given 2 contracts to SpaceX for about $150 million total to demonstrate the delivering 100 tons of cargo within an hour. So they're helping to get this first proof of concept for SpaceX to get there. So do the first demo, say another year or two, probably 2 years, and then get to immediately launching a lot of cargo. How I see this rolling out is they'll connect continents first. So if I have a FedEx, UPS, or other delivery, for global stuff, I'm collecting stuff into, say, 3 central points on a continent. In North America, they, would be, central extent of the country, western part, eastern part, and then you're collecting all the packages and stuff into central sorting and whatever warehouses. You can then, we sort out and you say, okay, these ones that are going international to Europe, or another one going to Asia, you then would fly with the rocket, taking the cargo over to the other continent, to the right some part of the continent, and then you shave off 8 to 12 hours off of international delivery. So instead of 2-day international delivery, it could be, twice a day international delivery. And then you get thousands of cargo flights. Once you master that and done 100,000 flights, you can say, okay, look, we only had 10 crashes of 100,000. We're starting to be safe enough for certain applications of air travel. Get even safer than that, prove it with an actual 1 million launches and only have 1 crash or less, and hopefully have some kind of abort system where people can escape in case of a crash problem. Then you're safe enough to take out air passenger travel. And then you transition from having taken over the $140 million air cargo delivery and created a new twice a day air cargo market, and also create a secondary stage where you're connecting the top 80, top 100, 200 major cities in the world with point-to-point travel for cargo. And then you built out all your spaceports that you have with the cargo, and then you have people start to go on those things. The $600 billion air travel market would then be taken. So that's how things will roll out. Communications dominance, generating $100 billion, then trillions of dollars. Simultaneously, get out air cargo, take out a new twice-a-day delivery market, which might be $100 billion, and then also take out the existing air cargo delivery, most of it, and then move on to air passenger travel. So that will be how SpaceX will dominate global communications and air cargo, mainly within 5 years, and then completely, in the next 10 to 15 years. So if you like that, please like and subscribe on YouTube and support me on Patreon. And I look forward to hearing from you in my next video. Thanks.